Thanks for joining us today. As Kate mentioned, my name is Larry Decuers, and I'm one of the curators at the National World War II Museum. However, I am not the curator of the Ghost Army exhibit here at the museum. Credit for that goes to James Lynn, who I'm filling in for today. Never fear, we do have actual experts on the subject of the Ghost Army today. We're joined with the authors of The Ghost Army of World War II, Rick Beyer and Elizabeth Sayles. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here, Larry. Thank you so much for having us. We're going to start, we always like to start the Ghost Army presentations when we can, with a little chance for the veterans themselves to talk and for you to see a little bit of kind of what this looked like in action. So Liz, if it's okay, we'll start with a little video, about a 3-minute video that gives you an overview of this amazing World War II unit that used deception to fool the Germans on the battlefields of Europe. You'll note as you watch the video, well, I'll just let it go. Here it is.
A little bundle of stuff, all compressed before you opened the bundle, spread the nozzles around, and inflated it.
The artillery piece was good, but that M4 tank, that was the beauty. That was a piece of work.
Back of my half-track, I tell my children, was the biggest boombox you ever saw, but it played sounds of tanks and activity.
They had recordings of building a pontoon bridge or any type of bridge, and you could hear them hammering away and swearing. And
we were turned loose in town. Go to the pub, order some omelets, and talk loose.
To be in the middle of this incredible adventure with the world at war in a foreign country, I just had to put it down.
We were sleeping in hedgerows and foxholes, but nothing kept us away from going someplace to do a watercolor.
We moved on up into this last grand deception.
And there was nothing between us but our hopes and prayers that separated us from the Panzer Division.
They're 300 yards, they're 200 yards, and suddenly you realize that's the enemy.
I used to refer to us as the Cecil B. DeMille Warriors.
It's always great to see those veterans. You know, Liz, I just realized that every veteran in that video has passed away.
Yeah, but at pretty ripe old ages. And they had
Arthur Shilstone being the last one just a couple of weeks ago. Wow. What we thought we'd do to talk about the Ghost Army today is kind of give you a little virtual tour of the wonderful exhibit that the World War II Museum has put on with the assistance of the Ghost Army Legacy Project, curated, as mentioned, by James Lynn, who did a great job. And the exhibit includes replica inflatables of the inflatables used by the unit. It includes interesting items designed by the museum staff, and it includes a lot of fantastic archives donated by veterans and by veterans' families originally to the Ghost Army Legacy Project, and the archive that we donated to the National World War II Museum. I think it's a great way to tell the story. And Liz, what I was gonna say, before the video played when I kept talking badly there was that for those of you watching, this is not Operation Fortitude, just in case you're thinking it is. This is a different deception operation that happens on the battlefields of Europe after D-Day and going for the rest of the war. So you ready to look at this exhibit, Liz?
Yes.
Well,
excited.
Why don't we go to the next slide and Liz, tell us about it.
Yeah, so this is a replica of a cannon, an inflatable cannon that they would use, and you can see that it's obviously fake, but what they would do is they would cover it with camouflage and treat it as if it was a real piece of equipment, so that the Germans would think, you know, if it was just sitting out there in the open, the Germans would be a little suspicious, but they treated it as if it was a real piece of equipment, and they would just have like maybe a little gun barrel sticking out so that any aerial reconnaissance, you know, or spies would see it there.
This is it's actually reduced in size a little bit for the exhibit. This would be a 105 millimeter artillery piece, and so it's probably at about 50%, 60% of actual size. But as you pointed out, in addition to the camouflage, there's a lot of artistry that goes into displaying these, and a lot of the guys in the visual camouflage unit were artists. So they're going to do everything they can to make it look real. So you might have sandbags around it. You might have fake artillery shells around it, not fake artillery shells, used spent artillery shells. Anything that might suggest to a German observer who's flying over in an airplane or looking from a distant church top that there's real artillery there. And they had flash canisters that they could fire at night so that it even looks like the artillery is firing. So pretty, you know, once you start to look at what they did, sort of amazing details on all of it.
Yeah, they were all really good with the details. It was very important.
Can we go to the next slide? So Liz, this is a inflatable M7 Priest armored vehicle, and it's about 8/10 of actual size. So it's close to actual size, but not actual size. And these inflatables, by the way, were made by Starbound Entertainment in Pennsylvania and my friend Tony McKay, who has done so much to help us tell this story with these visuals. And it's a great centerpiece for the exhibit here.
Just the ones at the museum, but the ones in the war were made by rubber
The ones
factory.
in the war were made by rubber factories, and all across the eastern part of the United States, as far you know, west as Illinois and Indiana, I think. And they were made by women. They were made often by young women who are working for 65 cents an hour in the stinking rubber factory, gluing these things together and wondering what the heck they're for.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, my father was in the Ghost Army, which is how I met Rick. And he used to say how they would, you know, pick up these rubber tanks and turn them around. And they sometimes they just thought it was a big joke, and they would treat them like big balloons and like bounce them up and down until that was pretty much made a court-martial offense, because they didn't want spies wherever they were in France or Germany or Luxembourg or wherever to see them bouncing these tanks around.
Well, and that's a great point. I think a lot of the guys who were in the unit didn't necessarily take it real seriously at first. You know, it's like, here's this, what did you say? Your dad said, oh.
Yeah, my dad said, oh, they had a bunch of artists that enlisted and they didn't know what to do with them, so they gave them fake equipment.
But
they didn't think they could shoot straight.
They didn't take it seriously at first until they realized, as Victor Dowd said, and still we realized they were shooting at us, you know, until they realized the role that they were playing. And I think it's one of the interesting and dramatic parts of this story is that the longer they're there in Europe, the more they come to understand how important it is and how complicated this job is, that fooling the enemy can be harder and in some ways just as dangerous as fighting the enemy. So why don't we go to the next slide here. And this is one of my favorite things in the exhibit. And this is a replica of a Phony headquarters. So wait a minute, a Phony headquarters? So when they were doing deceptions, they had a thing called special effects, where they are to fool any enemy spies that are left behind. So guys are wearing fake shoulder patches. They've got fake markings on their vehicles, and they would have officers play higher ranking officers of these divisions and these regiments that they're impersonating. So they'd set up a phony headquarters, and they'd have jeeps parked in front and guys coming in and out, so that anybody who's watching thinks it's a real regimental headquarters. And in this case, this is a replica of the 119th Regimental Headquarters of the 30th Division in Operation Viersen, and it's just north of Dulken, Germany. And this is the real one. So this is really cool. It's a fake. We have a fake headquarters, right? In the exhibit, we have a rendition of what the real fake headquarters looked like, and you can see some of the things that if you look at this picture, right, you see the Crisis CP sign, you see the Tivoli beer sign, the Coca-Cola sign, and you see it on the Jeep, by the way, where it says 119th Regiment, 30th Division. I'm pointing at it. No one can see me pointing. Look, I'm pointing at it. Oh, they've put the arrow there. Wow, they are really on top of this. And then, so now go back again. And so here's the one in the exhibit. So this really is, it really is something that's really right from their war experience. And the guy who, there was a guy from the Ghost Army, a captain named George Reb, who was pretending to be a colonel in this fake headquarters. And he was there one day when a couple of other officers came by in a Jeep, not from the Ghost Army, but from another unit. They were lost, whatever, but they come into this headquarters, and they had gone to West Point with him, and they knew him. And suddenly they're still captains and he's a colonel, and they couldn't figure out how he became a colonel. And they didn't ask him because they were too nervous. So they asked his sergeant as they were leaving, and the sergeant said, well, he said, fortunes of war. That's all he would say. But that happened in this building that's reproduced in the exhibit. And check out the Coca-Cola sign. Did you think that there'd be Coca-Cola signs on German buildings in World War II?
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, they drank a lot of Coca-Cola. Go forward to the real one again, and you'll see it's there. They drank a lot of Coca-Cola in Germany before the war, and then when the war started and they were cut off from the Coke supplies, the Germans invented Fanta. That was their replacement. That was the World War II replacement for Coca-Cola in Germany.
A poor replacement.
Yeah.
But I love this other story of the special effects, Rick, about the, they were measuring signs. Some of the guys were measuring signs, and I guess a colonel drove up and said, "What the heck are you doing there?"
Right. So they're measuring signs because they have to be able to reproduce the signs the way any division would do them. Every division does road signs and other stuff differently. They want to be realistic, so they're measuring this sign to see what size it would be. So put it in their notebook in case they're impersonating that division. The colonel drives up and he says, "What the hell are you men doing?" "Well, sir, we're measuring this sign." And then the guy, he lost it, as the story goes, that comes down to us from George Martin, who was one of the men there. The colonel is like, "Don't you know there's a war on, and we've got soldiers who are in France and they're measuring signs?" And he was very upset, and they just kept measuring the sign and putting that in the notebook. So why don't we go ahead, Liz, and tell us what we're seeing here.
Okay, so there was there was a lot of artists in the Ghost Army, especially in the 603rd, which was the visual deception unit. And one of the soldiers was Jack Macy, who actually had a part in designing some exhibits at the National World War II Museum. But he had the idea that he was going to do a caricature drawing of every single one of the soldiers in his company. And so he did all these crazy drawings of everybody. And then this is when they were in Luxembourg, which they were stationed in for a long time. And he had them printed. He had copies printed for everybody who was in the unit, in the company with him, which included my dad. And I remember my father showing it to me, and I'm saying, "What do you mean he had them printed in Luxembourg?" That was like on the front line. They were like in the thick of it. There were printing shops open, and they're doing these caricature studies. And he said, "Well, people needed to keep making a living, and they had to, go on. So things were open. Businesses that could be open were open. And so he got these printed up, and he gave copies to everybody in the company, and they signed them to each other like yearbooks that you have like in high school or college. And this is my father's. These are all signed to my father.
And
it's really fun.
It's worth saying again what you said. So Jack Macy, the caricaturist who did this, his company, Metaform, they designed the original exhibits at the National World War II Museum back when it was called the D-Day Museum. So it's very cool that a guy who was in the Ghost Army helped create this museum that's now hosting the Ghost Army exhibit. I think we have a close-up of that Bill Blass caricature. Bill Blass was one of the people in the unit, a number of artists who went on to some degree of fame. And he, if you're older than a certain age, you know that Bill Blass was a very, very famous fashion designer in the 1980s.
Yeah, he was in the unit with my dad. And I remember the first thing my father told us was that the first thing Bill Blass did was he took his entire uniform apart and re-sewed it so that it fit his figure better. And so he always looked pretty snappy.
And Jack, who did this caricature, said that described Bill as reading Vogue in his foxhole.
Yeah.
Which is hard to believe. And the thing about the Ghost Army story, for those of you who've maybe you've seen the documentary or read the book, or maybe you've just come to it today and don't know anything about it at all, it's an amazing World War II deception story, and these guys are often on and near the front. But I love all the personal stories and the little funny things and the little details that kind of make this such a different World War II story.
Absolutely. Yeah, my dad said that Bill Blass would do drawings of women's fashions, and he would send them off to Argentina during the war. And he would get like $2 a drawing. But apparently, according to one of the notebooks that we saw, he still owed everybody a lot of money because they were always gambling, and he apparently wasn't very good at it, so he was losing.
And Bill and Liz's dad and Jack Macy, all these guys, they were in the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. That's the visual deception arm of the Ghost Army. There's 3 different deception parts of the Ghost Army: visual, sonic, and radio, and then all of them together are working on special effects. So it's kind of like 4D deception going on in the battlefields of Europe with 22 different deceptions. Can we see the next slide? This is a pretty cool part of the exhibit. I thought of course it's a big swastika. I guess that's pretty obvious. But what's interesting is that this was a flag that was brought home by a soldier named Joe Spence. And if you look at it carefully, or if we could just even go to the next slide, you'll see that it's signed by all these guys in his company. I think he was in Company A of the 603rd. And what's interesting is that we just discovered recently that the Holocaust Museum and Tolerance Center in Long Island has an identical flag donated by another Ghost Army veteran, Stanley Fish, and it's signed by many of the same people. And so I was fascinated by that, and Liz, by the idea that the executive director of that museum was talking about, which is in a way that these soldiers in signing this flag the way they did, they've kind of co-opted this symbol of hate.
I thought it was pretty interesting because, a lot of the soldiers in the Ghost Army were Jewish, or the ones that I knew.
Significant number, yeah.
And I remember seeing the swastika, and I was like, wow, like, why would you bring that back? Like, that just seems like, a stab in the heart. But yeah, I think they really appropriated the symbol just by writing all over it. And in the next slide, you can see where they had, towns they took back from the Germans, right?
Right. So there were some Ghost Army soldiers who who were involved in the D-Day landings. That's an area we're still doing some research on, but they all came in over either Omaha or Utah Beach. Thionville is on the Moselle River. It's a town not far from Luxembourg. And Wessel, which is what it says in the upper right, is a town along the Rhine in Germany near where they did one of their deceptions. And I always like to tell people that the interesting thing about Wessel is that in 1945, when it was under American control, there was an American sergeant who was the mayor of Wessel, acted as the mayor for that time. His name was Henry Kissinger. So just, again, not in the Ghost Army, but just kind of a weird little sidelight. So Liz, let's go forward, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about some of the art that's here in the exhibit done by some of the artists in the 603rd.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of so when the Army was deciding to do this deception unit, they realized that they needed artists who could sort of imagine what things would look like. And so they went looking at, from the air or from, like you said, from a distance. So they went to art schools where my father was recruited from, and some of these guys were already working in comics, and some of them were just professional illustrators and theater people at the time. So the first two, actually the first three panels here are by Arthur Schulstone, who just recently passed away this month.
Just like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. And so the picture on the left shows part of the special effects that we were talking about, where the soldiers would make these patches of the whatever unit they were impersonating, and then they would sew it on their uniforms, and then they would go out in town and pretend to be from that unit. And they would say that their sleeves were ragged from all the times they sewed their uniforms on, the patches on, and then had to rip them off again. They got really good at sewing. So that's one of his things. And the second one in the middle there is a painting of what would happen in the morning when the soldiers woke up and the inflatables would sort of collapse a little bit. So there was the sinking gun barrel, and that they would say was a pretty bad look. So they had to inflate that pretty fast.
Well, I remember Arthur, when he was showing us this painting, which he did after the war, but of stuff that happened during the war, he said, yeah, we didn't have any guns that shot into the ground like that. And somehow
but you can also see how it's camouflaged too with that.
You can just see a little bit of the camouflage there. And then the stuff on the right, though, so the stuff on the left is done after the war, but those 5 panels on the right, those are sketches that Arthur did during the war. I think we've got a close-up of one of them.
Yeah, this was the landing in Normandy, and this was D-Day, 18 days after D-Day, when the Ghost Army went over. And you can see he painted this with ink just in the spur of the moment, like when he's on the landing craft. And you can see the barrage balloons up top, which were to keep the German planes from coming down too close. But yeah, this is amazing.
Can you imagine being a young soldier? I don't remember how old Arthur was at that time, but he was 98 just now, and it's 75 years ago, or 76 now years ago to D-Day. So you can see he was 22, something like. And you're standing there on a landing craft. You're about to join the invasion army in a foreign country that you've never been to. There's all these boats out there. You've got your pack on and your 60 or 80 pounds of gear. You're about to climb down a rope net into some little landing craft, and you whip out your notebook, or you whip out your pen and your notebook. You say, well, I think I'll just capture a little sketch of this right here.
Well, that was his whole thing. He said to be in the middle of this war on a foreign soil and to not capture it would be crazy. I show this to my students, and I'm like, you see, you have no excuse.
And I think that's why I've always thought that the art was an important part of telling the story. It doesn't have anything to do with the actual deception, but it is the way that these guys are documenting their time. And so we're looking at Arthur Schulstone's account, in essence.
Yeah, and I don't think they were allowed to document the actual fake tanks or any of that. That was illegal. Yeah.
Then we have a painting from another artist, Arthur Singer.
Yeah, this is Arthur Singer, he was a little older. He was already, I think, pretty established. He was already working as an illustrator, amazing watercolor artist. And a lot of the younger guys who were, like I said, some of them were from art school, they looked up to him and they learned from him. But at the same time, Rick, you just got a book from that was made by his son. And I was reading it and he said how much he learned just because he just never stopped, he never stopped painting. They had a lot of downtime. They didn't do it,
Don't tell our publisher that we're advertising somebody else's book during our webinar.
But he said how, he said, he learned a lot just by constantly doing it. And, because they had a lot of downtime. They had a lot of time when they were sitting around and so they had time to practice their painting.
And this is a self-portrait of Arthur. And he's another guy who went on to quite a career. He became a very well-known wildlife illustrator, illustrated the book Birds of North America, many other books.
Stamps for the...
Yeah, there was a series,
service.
you may recall, the Birds and Flowers of the 50 States Postage Stamp series, if you're old enough, from the 1980s. And Arthur did that with his son. And so just quite an amazing career. And there's some work of his hanging up in the exhibit, work of Arthur Shilstone and work of some of the other artists as well. Let's move on to the next thing here. And so here's some artwork, but here's some artwork that was part of their job during World War II. So we talked to you about special effects, right? This is the impersonation, the personal deceptions that they're doing. And we mentioned fake shoulder patches. Well, here are some fake shoulder patches in the exhibit. These are actual fake shoulder patches made by Ghost Army soldiers during World War II. And these come from the collection of a veteran named Seymour Nussenbaum, who's one of only about 16 veterans of this 1,100-man unit who are still left. And he put them in his scrapbook. And so you have the 1st Division, the 2nd Division, the 9th Division, the 26th, which was called the Yankee Division, so it looks like YD. You've got the 28th, which was the Keystone Division. They also referred to that as the Bloody Bucket Division, based on that patch. And you've got the 29th, the Blue and Gray Division, and the 29th, amazing story during World War II. But Seymour estimates that they made, over the course of the war, he and the other guys who made the fake patches made about 40,000 of them.
Wow.
Because they made them not only for the deceptions they did, but for the deceptions that they thought they were going to do, and then they got canceled.
And they were all stenciled. They made they cut stencils out, and just they would print a lot of them up.
Yeah, they're made. Larry, were you asking a question or just clearing your throat?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, Rick and Liz, I read in your book that the Ghost Army was probably as equally successful in fooling our troops as they were the Germans.
Yes, that was sometimes a problem.
Well, sometimes more successful. Who knows? But we certainly have a lot of accounts of the Ghost Army fooling their fellow American soldiers. And some of those accounts come from, other Americans thinking that somebody's in their division because they've got the division patch and they've got the Jeep with the division markings and kind of being mistaken there. And one of my favorite stories in that regard is a guy named Jack McGlynn. And he was a sergeant, and he was leading a convoy of trucks during the Battle of the Bulge, and they're pretending to be from the 90th Division going this way when the real 90th Division is going to be going this way, right? And they all have 90th Division markings on them, but there's a screw up because there's always a screw up, and they end up going through a traffic checkpoint with MPs from the real 90th Division. And they don't recognize any of these guys. And so the MP from the 90th Division comes over to Jack McGlynn and he says, well, what's the password? And Jack McGlynn says, I don't know the password. And he says, well, what's last month's password? He says, I don't know any of the passwords. And so now this guy thinks he's got a German infiltrator, because this is during the Battle of the Bulge when the Germans, some of them were putting on American uniforms and infiltrating. And so now he's kind of beckoning over his fellow MP, and he's getting his Thompson 7 machine gun. He's going to quiz him, because that's what they did. You remember, you've seen it in the movies, right? They ask him about baseball or something. And he says, where are you from? And Jack says, Boston. And the guy says, Boston's a big place. Where? And Jack says, well, I'm from the town of Medford. And then the guy really shocks him. He says, oh, yeah? Well, what's the name of the school on Harvard Street? Because it turned out he ran into somebody else from Medford, right? Of the 2 million people in the theater of war there, he'd run into somebody who grew up a quarter of a mile away from him. So he always said he knew the name of the school on Harvard Street, and that's what saved his life during that time. But yeah, and because they couldn't tell. They couldn't say, oh, we're in the fake unit. First of all, not a great explanation, okay? Second of all, you don't want to tell people, because even if our own forces realize, right, that there's a fake unit, a unit doing this kind of deception, that's a great story. It'll start getting around, and then the enemy will learn it, and then you're in trouble.
Yeah, it was very top secret, and but sometimes it was a problem, because sometimes our soldiers would go through where the Ghost Army had set up a deception and thought it was clear, and that the Ghost Army was going to protect them because they had all this equipment, which turned out to be fake, and it was tragedy. It was tragic.
Yeah. So one of the lessons they really learned is you have to coordinate with the high level people who are in the know pretty carefully to avoid the problems happening at the lower level. So I love this. This is a map, Liz. I'll just say that it was made by a veteran named Al Sevier, and it was donated to the museum by his son.
This was sort of a new addition. A new addition. We hadn't seen it before.
We hadn't seen it before, and tell us your impressions of it.
I love it. I love the it's all like hand lettered, and it's really about his experience. And then there's these little tiny paintings that he puts all over that are kind of a little bit sarcastic, a little tongue in cheek. But you can see that he was in Normandy, north of France, Rhineland, Ardennes, and then I think he was wounded, right? And he
was wounded in February 1945 in Operation Bougainville. And, one of the things that you noticed, Liz, that I had never noticed looking at this, is that the right-hand side of the map is kind of like a blow-up where it's light-colored. It's a blow-up of a smaller area, and so that's why you see some of the same towns twice.
Yeah, and why the rivers end at the dotted line.
Right, and I was like, I couldn't believe I hadn't even noticed that in the several times that I'd looked at the map. But that was a great exhibit. And I mean, obviously we're only showing you a little bit of what's in this amazing exhibit, which, Larry, is up until the end of the year, right? It's up until, I think, January 3rd or January 2nd or something like that. Check the website for accurate listings. And it has some interactives. I don't know if they may not be interacting right now because of the COVID situation, but one of them is this next piece here, which is a video, and our video may not play that well in the slide here. But what's kind of cool about that, this is not the last video, guys. You tech guys in the background, so that's one more video coming. I should have warned you. But one of the parts of this deception that's really important is the radio deception, and the radio deception involves using Morse code. And the Morse code, so in the exhibit, we gave people a chance to look at the way that you send Morse code and try to be able to send Morse code. And what's interesting is you say, well, okay, they're setting up a fake radio network. So they're sending out fake signals that the enemy's supposed to hear. But why is that hard? You just send that with the Morse code. But the enemy could figure out the sending style of individual U.S. telegraphers, the speed that they send with, where they make mistakes or hesitate or something. So they could identify, it's called the fist of the operator. And so the Ghost Army guys had to learn how to mimic or imitate the fist or sending style of the real radio operators in order to convince the Germans. And again, that's the attention to detail.
Yeah, so when one unit was moving in and another unit was, and the Ghost Army would go and pretend that unit was still there, they would take over that style of sending Morse code. and so the other unit would be gone, or vice versa. You know,
And I always say that radio is like the least sexy thing the Ghost Army did, right? So they got inflatable tanks, that's really cool. And you got sound effects, that's really cool. Oh, we're pretending to be officers, high-ranking officers, generals even, that's really cool. And then it's like, guys are sending radio signals. And that's like not so cool. But it is in fact one of their most effective means of deception to set up these phony radio networks. And a lot of effort went in to make that work.
Yeah, they needed to have the whole thing because the Germans were not easily fooled, and so they needed to really have like everything in place that a real unit would have. So I think this was amazing, and one of the veterans that was at the opening of the National World War II Museum exhibit was Stanley Nance, who was one of the radio operators.
Yeah, and he was in the room where this was playing, and he was giving everybody a lecture, 102 years old, giving everybody a lecture on how it worked. I think we have one more slide in this PowerPoint that we can go through. This is my favorite part of the exhibit, is the shelf of our books at the bookstore. Did we mention that Liz and I are the authors of The Ghost Army of World War II? And a fine book it is, if I do say so myself. Larry, you've read it. You're a neutral observer.
Yes, it's a fascinating book, and it's full of information, and I guess
and pictures.
A lot of pictures.
We're going to have a second volume to this book.
Believe me, we
would love to, because we've found so much new stuff. We're still getting stuff. Rick just the other day
met a new veteran yesterday. Yeah. Well, actually, I haven't talked to him yet, but it's a guy I didn't know about before, one of the radio guys, and we're supposed to talk this morning. So I'm early this afternoon. So I'm looking forward to that. But if our publisher is listening, yeah, another book, guys. That's what we want to do. And then what we thought before we get to the questions, and so we're just about ready to get to questions, and we hope you've enjoyed that little look at the exhibit, and which illustrates some of the things that the Ghost Army did. But we thought you might also enjoy seeing this video from the opening night of the exhibit, where not only did we have Ghost Army soldiers, veterans, 3 of them there, but we also had current U.S. Army psychological operations, PSYOPs soldiers. Those are the guys that are carrying on the Ghost Army tradition today. And so they were excited to be there and to meet kind of their heroes from the Ghost Army. Well, let's take a look at that video.
Stanley Nance.
The radio guy.
That's what it's all about.
There's Seymour.
Is that Sevier's son?
Yeah, it's Sevier.
It was overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming.
It was overwhelming too. It was great, and it was it was probably one of the last big things the museum did before the whole
right
COVID
before it was
thing
shut down. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I love seeing the veterans there, though. That was
it was awesome, and that Stanley Nance, who was looking at the tank and said that's what it's all about. He's 102. He's one of the radio operators, but he's still only the second oldest surviving veteran of the Ghost Army, because there's Gil Seltzer, who's 105 and turns 106 in October, and he's the oldest surviving veteran of the unit. So Larry, that's our little tour of the exhibit. Kind of an interesting way, I think, to look at the story, a little different than our usual presentations. I hope people have enjoyed that. But we are here to fill in and answer any questions that people have, or that you have, or the audience has. So sling them at us.
All right. Yeah, we have a bunch of them. I'll just start with the first one we have. Is the movie Ghost Army available to watch in its entirety? If so, where?
Yes, the documentary, The Ghost Army, is available on Amazon Prime. So the DVD is for sale on Amazon, of course, but if you are an Amazon Prime member, you can watch it for free. And by the way, if you are an Amazon Prime member, you can download the Ghost Army Kindle book for free. So there you go. There's 2 free things you can do with Amazon Prime and the Ghost Army. And I should say that I made that documentary also.
Yes.
I'm not shy about saying that. That would be.
It's a fantastic documentary.
It's great. And I always tell people that my father really never knew what he accomplished in the Ghost Army, because he always thought it was kind of like this kind of weird thing. But when he saw Rick's documentary and the different stages and some of the exhibitions that we put together, he was really proud, because he had no idea that, they did what they did and they accomplished what they accomplished.
And I interviewed 21 veterans, I think, of the unit for the documentary film, and we donated the originals of all those interviews and the transcripts of those interviews to the National World War II Museum, so they are there in the archives at the National World War II Museum for future researchers.
So I'll go to the next question we have. How did the soldiers of the Ghost Army respond to enemy fire when they were attacked?
They tried to avoid that situation as much as possible. They would dig in. I mean, that's, one of the things that they always did is they dug in whenever they were in a position. And of course they have a lot fewer people than a real unit would have, so that if you're on the front line or near the front line and you're dug in, hopefully the casualty level will be lighter if you come in under artillery fire. They had 3 guys killed in action and several dozen wounded, some requiring evac back to the U.S. So they did take casualties. They were never assaulted by sort of infantry. I mean, they never were overrun. They were very careful in the way they used them. And for example, at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, they were conducting a deception, pretending to be the 75th Infantry Division. And they were pretty much wrapped up with that deception anyway, but they hustled them out of there. And in fact, they hustled them out of Luxembourg City, where they were bivouacked at the time, and hustled them back to Verdun to get them out of the way. Which is really interesting, because this is a time when they're trying to throw every soldier they can into the front lines. And Eisenhower says, nope, this unit, I want to retire them back because I want to preserve that deception capability. And so they weren't part of the, when the troops were getting overrun. And then in January, in the second half of the Battle of the Bulge, they play a pretty big role. They're involved in 6 or 8 deceptions over the course of the next month or so as the Americans kind of claw back territory.
Yeah, and they did have another unit that was the 406, which was like the part of them that was like the fighting part that had.
Right, they had a combat engineering unit that had some 50 caliber machine guns mounted on jeeps, and they would, they put up a perimeter. I mean, they're trying to take care of themselves, and all of the soldiers, had carbines or some kind of weapon, but they would have been in really bad shape had they actually taken a concerted tank or infantry attack. And that's why it was so important to keep the secret, right? That's why you can't let the enemy know, because if the enemy knows, oh my God, they could slice through them like butter.
So we have a question about the inflatables. So the question is, were any of these inflatable tanks hit by shrapnel or enemy fire to the point where they deflated? How were they constructed so that they wouldn't deflate?
Well, they're constructed in an interesting way. So they're not they're not giant balloons, which is kind of what you think. And it's kind of the way we've made the replicas, because it's easier to do it, is to make them big balloons. But the original ones, it's actually a skeleton of tubing. So it's a skeleton, an inflatable skeleton, if you can imagine that, of tubing that might be like this big around, that creates the shape of the tank. And then over that, you have like a rubberized canvas skin, neoprene skin over that. And it's all segmented, which so it's quicker to blow up because you don't have to fill up the whole thing with air. And it also means that if shrapnel hits one piece of that, it's not going to, be like a big balloon and be kind of silly cartoon looking. It's going to sag, it's going to have some problems, but it's not going to get blown up that way. And so they did have, they were constantly repairing these and dealing with them being hit with shrapnel or having other damage done to them. Some of the soldiers claimed that they used chewing gum on the repairs, but I think more commonly they used sort of the equivalent of a bicycle patch kit. You have some rubber cement and pieces of rubber, and I'm sure by the end of the war, they were looking pretty ratty. And in fact, at the end of the fighting in Europe, when they thought that the Ghost Army was going to have to go to the Pacific, they burned all of their dummies because they were in such bad shape they didn't want to take them back, and they figured they'd get new ones for the invasion of Japan.
One of our viewers would like a little background on one of the Ghost Army members, Ellsworth Kelly.
Well, I'm going to leave my co-author.
Oh, all right. Well, Ellsworth Kelly was, he was very young. I think he was 18 and a student when he joined the Ghost Army. Actually, he came a little bit later, and then he became one of the world famous minimalist painters. I mean, he's gigantic. He died just a few years ago, but he did he was very influenced by his time in the Ghost Army. His artwork was influenced by it. I actually did a talk at the Blanton Museum a couple of years ago about, because they have a big exhibit. They have his chapel that he built there. And the shadowing that we saw before on that artillery piece, and all of these shadows and the stenciling, all of that really influenced what he did later in life. And of course he was gigantic.
Yeah. One of the stories about Ellsworth Kelly in the theater, in the theater of war, he was very shy, and a friend of his actually met Picasso and got invited. Another guy in the unit, got invited to Picasso's studio. And he didn't want to bring Ellsworth Kelly because he thought he was going to be like kind of tongue-tied.
He's really shy. He was very, very, very shy. My father said that he never talked to anybody.
And
he really kept himself.
Wouldn't appreciate it. And then, of course, Ellsworth Kelly is the one of the unit who becomes sort of the most famous. He comes back to France after the war. So he's been exposed to France during the war. He comes back after the war and studies there. And one of the things that's interesting, I don't know if I can flip through and find the image quickly enough here, because I'm not necessarily that good at knowing every page that everything is on. But the painting here, this one that I'm tapping, have I got the right one, Liz? Can you see it? That's an Ellsworth Kelly.
Yeah, that's his. Yeah.
From World War II,
yeah.
The one right here.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting about his World War II paintings, they're nothing like his later minimalist work, but they are, you can sort of see in his mind's eye the development. It's all about shapes and colors in these artworks.
And even as he's going through the war, you can see his artwork changing. Like his self-portrait that we have in the book is it's just black, basically. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and so, and he didn't talk a whole lot about his Ghost Army experiences afterwards. There's not, I will say that he did not want to be interviewed for the Ghost Army documentary.
He talked about it, and he went to Pratt
right.
also, and he was interviewed by them, and he did talk
right.
to them about it in one of their
And there's an NPR piece you could probably look up that they did on the Ghost Army a while back, more than 10 years ago, I think. And he's interviewed in that, as is Jack Macy. You can probably Google that on the NPR website, find it.
We have a question coming in about, can you give us any background on the Ghost Army's insignia of the ghost with the lightning bolts? How did that come to pass, I guess?
So, yes and no. I can give you some of that story, and some of it is still shrouded in doubt and disagreement. But the easy part of the story is that in College Park, Maryland, in the National Archives, what they call Archives 2, which is where all of the U.S. government's military records are, there are 4 slim boxes that hold the very few records from this secret unit. So it's secret, so they didn't put much on paper. And one of the things in that box, in those boxes, is the official history of the unit written right at the end of the war by an officer in the unit named Fred Fox. A hysterically funny document which is reproduced on our website, ghostarmy.org. Maybe it's not hysterical, but it's funny in addition to being a serious. It's funny for an army history.
It's tongue-in-cheek. It's definitely tongue-in-cheek.
Let me say that among the genre of U.S. Army official histories, this is pretty funny. But the cover of that is a hand-painted cover showing all of the insignia of the units that they impersonated, and then smack in the middle of it is that ghost symbol. And that's, to my knowledge, the first place it appeared. So it's on their official history from 1945, but we're not precisely sure who did it. I've heard some different stories. I'm not precisely sure who created it.
Because they didn't have their own patch. They just impersonated other units.
And even the phrase, the Ghost Army, which again, the earliest use of it I've seen is 1945. They did not call themselves that at the time. Nobody said, oh, I'm in the Ghost Army. They said—
My father never called it that.
No, they said, I'm in the 23rd. I'm in the 603rd if you're in the camouflage unit. I heard some people referred to it as the Instant Army, right?
Or the Phantom Army.
Add water and mix, Instant Army. But that ghost is on the cover of their official history. And so that, combined with the fact that the very earliest news articles, because there are a few news articles about this that appear before they impose secrecy, use the phrase Ghost Army. Those two things suggest to me that at least some people kind of thought of it that way. But that's all I know about where that insignia comes from. So it's from the official history, and that's where it starts. I have heard people say that maybe Fred Fox, who did the official history, designed it himself. But I've also heard that George Martin may have been involved in it, and maybe somebody else maybe somebody else sketched it out and said, "Hey, something like this," and some anonymous artists. There were probably more than 150 or 200 artists in this unit.
Well, another question: do we have any of the sound recordings used by the Sonic unit? Are those around?
No, we've never been able to find them. I bet they are around. It's on my list of projects to make a more concerted search. But I've talked to the National Archives, I've talked to the U.S. Army, gone to the Library of Congress. Haven't been able to find them. Like, there's no inflatables left and they wouldn't have lasted. So that, I don't ever hope to run across an original World War II inflatable. But the sound effects were on records. They were on big 16-inch discs. There were a lot of them. They would have been sort of big and heavy and durable. And I find it impossible to believe that some of them did not survive. So I'm on the lookout. If you find one, I'm looking for it, but I don't know where any are at the moment.
I guess we have one final question here. One of our viewers would like to know if there's any plans to make a feature film of this story.
So many plans.
Yeah. There's been an ongoing effort.
It's running around Hollywood.
It's kind of stalled a little bit at the moment. One of the things that's interesting is that I know of now, not including the current effort, which you can Google it, and Ben Affleck's been involved in it, although I'm not sure he's still involved in it. And it's optioning our book, but they still don't tell us very much. But one of the things that I've discovered is that there are at least 4 other screenplays written about this for major Hollywood studios over the last 60 years. This is a movie that a lot of people have wanted to make and somehow keeps not quite getting made. So we hope.
Right to your favorite movie studio.
right to your favorite movie star and get them on this. But if I can say, because you said that was the last question, and so I know we're about to wrap up. If I can add one other thing, and Liz's comment reminded me of it, a different thing, not regarding the movie. We are trying to get Congress to award this unit a Congressional Gold Medal. Because they couldn't be honored during World War II because of secrecy. They saved thousands of lives. Some people say more than 10,000 lives. They sort of used creativity and illusion to help win the war. We currently have 164 congressmen who are supporting legislation in the House and 20 senators supporting it, but we need more. And so I encourage people to reach out to their congressmen any way they can. And if you go on our website, ghostarmy.org, there's a page that gives you advice on how to do that. But any way you can, reach out, whether it's sending them an email, whether it's putting something on social media, and let's try to get the Congressional Gold Medal for the Ghost Army. The House bill is H.R. 2350, and the Senate bill is S. 1421. It's totally bipartisan. We've got people on from the liberal end to the conservative end, people from 40 states behind it. We just have to push to make it happen.
And there's a deadline, right? Isn't it the election?
Well, if we don't get it done by the end of December, then we have to start over again at the beginning of the next Congress. So we're really pushing because we've got so much support this time, and we'd like to do it while these guys are still here, and they're going. So we want to do it.
Yeah, a very richly deserved honor for this unit, no doubt. But we are up against the clock, and we are all out of time. Rick and Liz, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. You've been fantastic.
Thank you, Larry. It's great. And
all right. See you guys next time.
It's been great being a part of it.
It was great.